On a winter night in 39 AD, a red lantern burned against a noble door, a thin circle of flame that turned the marble stairs a strange, accusing color. Inside, a family held its breath. A father drew the covers closer over a frightened girl's shoulders and whispered her name so quietly he could not be sure she heard it. Then the knock came, deliberate, imperial, and without appeal. The summons was the single line that erased ordinary life, an emperor's command, delivered by a man with no authority but the power of his master to take and keep. In that moment, a girl of 14 ceased to be a daughter and became an object of state procedure. Unveiled, Caligula's brutal treatment of women in ancient Rome, is the story that follows. Not a sensational catalogue of private acts, but an investigation into how a palace ritual became a machine of control, how names were stripped away, how display was turned into punishment, how institutions disciplined bodies and silenced those who survived. We will look at the man who ordered it, the space where it happened, the mechanisms that made violence into ceremony, and the lives left unstitched in its wake. If you follow grim history like this, subscribe for deep dive narratives and stay with us for the whole account. To understand that winter night, we must go back to the boy who would become emperor. Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, known to history as Caligula, was born into a family that was both beloved and fatalistic. His father, Germanicus, was a military star, celebrated by the people. But the empire's favor is a brittle thing. When Germanicus died under circumstances that Romans whispered about as poisoning or at least foul neglect, a young Gaius was scarred by loss and public expectation. The boy's childhood followed the contours of public spectacle and private hardship, parades and applause on one hand, exile and suspicion on the other. When Caligula was sent to the island of Capri, so the sources tell us, he entered a court that was a theater of paranoia and indulgence. Tiberius, the emperor at the time, ruled from that remote, sun-washed rock not as a father of the people, but as a watchful, narrowing presence. The island palace, with its shaded porticos and secret corridors, shaped the young man's imagination. Beauty and menace became interchangeable, and trust became something to be weaponized. Ancient authors, notably Suetonius and Cassius Dio, trace a before and after in Caligula's rule. He arrived in Rome welcomed. Within a year of his accession, an acute illness afflicted him. According to some accounts, that sickness changed him. Historians debate whether it was physical, psychiatric, or a narrative device used by hostile chroniclers. What matters for our story is less the medical diagnosis and more the shift in behavior, a leader who began to see power not as a duty, but as an instrument for remaking people around him. Power consolidated at Rome often takes shape as ritual.
When rituals are constructed to humiliate or erase, they become instruments of terror. The Garden of Venus, as ancient sources describe a wing of the imperial household, was one such institution, where ceremonial beauty concealed systematic domination. Imagine a suite of courtyards and colonnades arranged around sculpted flower beds, small fountains glimmering like caught light, walls veined with pink marble and alabaster. Statues of goddesses overlooked mosaic floors. The perfume of orange and myrtle filled the warm air. Beauty, arranged and controlled, became an architectural argument. The emperor could stage any human being as an object to be admired, purchased, passed among favor seekers. But the garden was not merely aesthetic. According to accounts preserved in Roman chronicles, it functioned as a system. Girls and young women were summoned from noble houses and from lower neighborhoods alike. They arrived with the flimsy dignity of family names and were soon given other labels. New garments meant them to be seen differently. Jewels threaded like chains, new names that sounded like inventory. Ancient writers use images of renaming and numbering. Modern historians caution that these details may be exaggerated. Still, patterns of ritualized dehumanization appear repeatedly in the sources. The stripping of identity, the spectacle of parading the chosen before Rome's elite, the careful alternation of apparent tenderness and deliberate humiliation that broke the will of those inside. Institutions make such systems possible. The imperial household supplied a bureaucracy to process summonses, lists, attendance, rankings. The guards recorded arrivals and departures. The prefects ensured that the Senate's leading men, the commanders, the established noble families, all who came seeking favor, were given front-row seats to the displays. The mechanism of selection was itself a form of coercion. Families were told that offering a daughter could secure promotion, the remission of a debt, or the favor necessary for survival in a precarious social system. Silence was bought with favors, complicity with rewards. The daily life of the court taught us simple arithmetic: benefit now, forget later. Into that mechanism we insert a single life, Flavia. She is not a name you will find in the dusty lists of Rome. Flavia is a fictional composite, created from fragments of testimonies and the testimony of institutions, a figure meant to stand for many. She arrived on a winter night with her hair still damp from the road and her mother's eyes in her face. A 14-year-old from a respectable but neither rich nor noble household, she had been summoned under a pretense of service. Families in Rome learned to trust the emperor's envoy as they learned to trust taxes and public spectacle. The summons was part of life. The first days in the garden were designed to unmake home. They offered clothes that were at once sumptuous and designed to expose.
They gave silver that sat like promise on the wrist, spectacles that made the wearer feel chosen. A girl who had never known such attention found herself the center of a strange kindness. A teacher who adjusted a hem, an attendant who laughed softly at a joke. The kindness was deliberate. Those who designed the system knew that cruelty works best when it alternates with pleasure. By giving, they increased indebtedness. By flattering, they invited betrayal of one's own sense of self. Renaming worked as a conceptual knife. In official records, a proper girl might be listed as Flavia, daughter of Marcus, and then within the garden's ledgers receive a code or a diminutive used only inside the palace. A name is a shape for memory. To take it is to begin erasure. When girls were forced into ranks, the first, the second, the proposed favorites, they learned quickly that rank determined not only who they might be presented to, but what they'd be expected to endure. The parade was the centerpiece, a slow, deliberate procession through corridors hung with tapestries, where patrons and officers assembled to judge and choose. Men of power, senators by title, commanders wrapped in purple, and palace guests moved through the spectacle as if attending a market. The garden's design weaponized anticipation. Waiting rooms were small and scented. A girl was kept in a state of near expectation, told that tomorrow might bring a favor, tonight might bring a private audience, then withheld. Anticipation became punishment. Isolation followed. The guardians of the garden engineered rivalries among the girls, praising one in front of others, playing confidants, then withdrawing. Solidarity, the common thread that could have been a lifeline, was systematically cut. A whispered plan was heard. A look that might have been a pact to run away became a breach punished with isolation. When the first parade for Flavia took place, she still felt she could bargain with luck. Her garments glittered. The light caught her hair. Patrons' faces softened at her youth. But the ritual was not only appearance. It contained a private set of tests, humiliation staged as pleasures or as signs of favor that in truth were methods of control. The texts we rely on avoid explicit descriptions. Modern historians urge restraint because ancient writers sometimes embellished. Yet the pattern is clear. The girls were displayed, judged, and then distributed as if they were trophies rather than human beings. Those who resisted were isolated or punished in ways designed to teach submission without creating public scandal. The psychological effects were the intended consequence. Some girls, after weeks or months, learned to dissociate, to create an inner chamber where the body existed in one place and the mind in another. The world outside kept calling them by their family names, but the garden taught them new terminology, numbers, roles, the terms of a practice that reduced them to measurable units. Others broke in quieter ways. Suicides are mentioned in the sources as a grim punctuation to the institution, but historians caution against precise counts. What can be said without inflation is that the combination of ritual shame, social stigma, and the impossibility of telling the truth about what had happened made life unbearable for many survivors. Families, too, were gripped by shame, because public virtue was an asset in Roman life. A survivor returned from the garden could become an object of blame rather than sympathy. In a culture where chastity and reputation were currencies, those who bore the consequences of the garden's rituals were punished twice, once inside the palace and again by a society that preferred to forget. The architecture of complicity extended beyond the court to the empire's power brokers. Senators who attended the garden's displays gained access to sexualized spectacle and thereby accrued informal capital, favors, promotions, the appearance of being close to the emperor. Commanders seeking advancement discovered that participation could be purchased in human currency, a performance before the throne, a show of devotion, entertainments that blurred the line between public duty and private indulgence. The Praetorian Guard, charged with the emperor's safety, found power in its proximity.
its officers enjoyed privileges that were hard to renounce. Silence was incentivized by bronze and by fear. Those who spoke against the system risked exile, loss of patronage, or being marked for their own family's ruin. Yet systems need enforcers. The garden had attendants, bureaucrats, and medical men who kept the records, administered treatments, and assessed which girls were fit for which functions. There were physicians who recorded ailments in clinical language. There were servants who kept the lists and guarded the doors. Their obedience was not merely personal cruelty, it was an enactment of institutional practice, an implicit agreement to turn people into objects of curiosity. When power institutionalizes a practice, it legitimizes the small decisions that, compounded, create catastrophe. The reason the story of the garden matters is not only the figure of a single tyrant, but the way social and political incentives shaped ordinary behavior into complicity. Inside the garden, the days were a curriculum in humiliation. Consider Flavia's small rebellions, a note passed to another girl, a clasp changed between ranks to symbolize an alliance. Each attempt at solidarity was read by the institution as a threat. The response was measured to teach caution, removal to an inner chamber, the withholding of small favors, a public demonstration of disapproval. The point was to isolate and thereby to terrify.
When Flavia attempted to speak once to her mother in a private message, the household intercepted it. The message was returned, the envelope sealed with a sign that made the family understand it was better to remain silent. Words were dangerous because they threatened to name what had been done. Some survived by inventing inner measures of worth. Flavia learned to recite the names of poets and household formulas in her head, a private litany that preserved the sense that she was not wholly consumed. Others left the garden damaged and invisible. Marriages ended, communities closed ranks, and survivors found themselves without a place in a society that measured value by honor rather than by harm suffered. Those who attempted to petition the Senate or the Emperor found the channels closed. The state, when implicated, protects its own resources by burying testimony under protocol and legal silence. The political calculus broke in 41 AD with a sudden and violent rupture. Caligula's rule had accumulated enemies both private and institutional. A group of conspirators, among them a tribune named Cassius Chaerea, conspired to end the tyrant's life. Chaerea had grievances personal and political. He resented the ways the emperor mocked manhood and ritualized insult. On a winter day in the Cryptoporticus, a vaulted corridor beneath the Palatine, the conspirators struck. The emperor was attacked and killed in a flurry of knives and blows. Ancient sources vary in their choreography. Suetonius gives a dramatic account, Cassius Dio offers a different emphasis, but all agree on the suddenness and the brutality of the act. The palace erupted into confusion. Servants fled or were slaughtered. Doors were locked and smashed. The immediate aftermath was not a cathartic truth-telling. Violence breeds its own secrecy. Blood on the steps did not translate into public reckoning. Instead, as the empire reeled, institutions recalibrated. Claudius, related to the Julio-Claudian line and physically overlooked by many, emerged amid the chaos, and with the complicity of the Praetorian Guard was installed as emperor. His accession was as much a political decision as an act of survival. The new regime faced a choice: open the palace's wounds and subject the imperial household to scrutiny, or close ranks and restore a semblance of order. Claudius chose the latter. According to some accounts, Claudius and his advisors made a deliberate decision to bury the scandal of the Garden of Venus. Survivors were given gold, dowries, and comfortable marriages. They were returned to families with benefits attached and clear instructions to forget. The state's currency was compensation and silence. Was this a merciful attempt to repair damage, or an act of self-preservation that prioritized stability over justice? The answer matters because it reveals how empires prioritize reputation. Ancient writers imply that Claudius wished to prevent a public trial that would reveal the court's corruption, or that he feared a sequence of disclosures that could destabilize rule. Historians today note that sources are partisan and that details are disputed. What emerges, however, is a pattern in which the institutional response was to envelop victims in silence rather than in accountability. Silence functioned as erasure. When survivors were awarded material comfort while being required to forget, the state converted memory into compensation. The effect on victims was complex and pernicious. The gold bought a kind of social reinsertion, but it did not heal the inner fractures. Some survivors lived the remainder of their lives in forced smiling, their private theaters closed. Others withdrew to provincial towns, their names spoken only by sympathetic mothers. In a society that equated female honor with family worth, the survivors faced a double punishment: the injury they endured and the culture's subsequent refusal to recognize it as injury. This was not merely the story of one cruel man. Caligula's behavior was the catalyst, but the garden's existence exposed how power structures, incentives, bureaucracies, social values can be marshaled to reproduce harm.
When an imperial household can monetize access to bodies and convert spectacle into political capital, the whole society is implicated. The Roman example matters because it is not exotic. It is a mirror of how concentrated authority and social reward structures can make moral blindness normal. To speak plainly about the survivor's aftermath, we must resist the temptation to fictionalize every detail. Flavia's story is composite precisely because the archival record is fragmentary. She is meant to embody the psychological realities of those who endured ceremony turned cruelty, the disassociation, the strategic amnesia, the family negotiations, the attempted self-harm that some took in secret. Those outcomes are not sensational inventions. They are plausible consequences of what ancient sources describe as ritualized degradation. Where sources disagree, on numbers of suicides, on the precise mechanics of daily life in the garden, we will mark those disagreements. Suetonius claims several extremes. Cassius Dio offers variations. Modern scholars argue over intent, scale, and credibility. Our primary obligation is to survivors' dignity, not to the thrill of certainty. There is a practical reason the court chose concealment. Open trials would have exposed senators, officers, and magistrates, the very people the regime needed to maintain order. Trials would have flayed the social fabric that the new emperor sought to mend. It was also a moral abdication. Justice deferred in this case meant justice denied to those who most needed recognition.
What did the garden leave behind beyond personal harm? It changed language. The terms used to describe a woman's worth shifted subtly. Where once a girl's value might have been discussed in terms of dowry or kinship, after the garden, the word survivor would mean something unacknowledged, someone who had endured a public instrument of humiliation without redress. Communities learned that silence was safer than exposure. Families learned that offering daughters to the emperor's needs could be protective. The moral costs were slow and systemic. There are lessons embedded in this history that do not require modern polemic to be urgent. First, centralized power without accountability produces moral sclerosis. The garden was possible because authority became absolute and answers to few. Second, institutions, once they normalize a practice, create incentives that convert complicity into routine. Small acts of convenience, a nod, a favor, a silent acceptance, compound into structural violence. Third, memory is a moral resource. When a society chooses forgetting over truth, it damages its ability to heal. We must also attend to the ethics of storytelling. Ancient sources are situated in their own politics. Suetonius and Cassius Dio wrote decades after the events, and with particular audiences and agendas. They had reasons to embellish or to emphasize the emperor's extremes. Modern historians sift these accounts and disagree on details: how many women were involved, the exact rites performed, even whether Garden of Venus is an accurate label or a rhetorical construct. When we tell the story of Flavia, we make explicit that she is illustrative, not a named participant in the sources. That necessary transparency is not a caveat to diminish the narrative, but a guardrail to preserve honesty. If you ask why this ancient story should trouble us today, the answer lies in the universals. Public institutions are composed of human beings who respond to incentives. When status, money, or power reward silence, many will choose the path of least disturbance. When spectacle is confused with justice, the tendency is to prefer the immediate theatrical remedy to the slow work of reform. The garden is a cautionary parable about how beauty and ritual can be turned into instruments of cruelty when they are harnessed for domination. There is a moral dimension to remembering. To remember is not merely to catalog wrongs, but to hold a place open for the lives that were altered. Historians and storytellers have an ethical duty to foreground the victim's dignity and to insist that institutional complicity be recognized. Flavia, if she had lived, would not have wanted pity. She might have wanted to be named and to know that what happened to her was not corrected by gifts alone. She would have wanted accountability that preserved human dignity over political convenience. The palace did not, in the end, become a place of reckoning.
The name of the garden survives mainly in the ink of hostile chroniclers and in the silence left when historians cannot reconstruct everything. The empire moved on with a new emperor who prioritized consolidation over inquiry. The girls who returned to their families with gold kept their secrets, learned to fit into households that pretended nothing had happened, or withdrew into provinces where their names were forgotten by the centers of power. We close with a few precise historical notes. Many ancient accounts describe Caligula's excesses and the garden's ceremonies. Chief among these are Suetonius and Cassius Dio. Their accounts are colored by the moral and political agendas of later writers. Modern scholarship debates the scale and the exact procedures described. Where sources disagree, we have said so explicitly. Flavia, as mentioned, is a composite, a fictional device representing the lived consequences reported by multiple testimonies and implied in institutional records. Her story condenses many experiences into one narrative arc to help us feel the human cost, without claiming that each specific event is individually documented. Remembering is a small corrective to the state's choice to forget. When public systems bury harm to maintain stability, they trade moral truth for political calm. That bargain impoverishes the social body. The lesson from the Garden of Venus is not an indictment only of an ancient emperor, but of any institution where reward structures and secrecy combine to protect perpetrators. Power derives legitimacy from its restraint and its accountability. Without these, it corrodes the very orders it seeks to preserve. If this unsettled you, tell us which part surprised you most in the comments. Like and subscribe for more deep dives into history's hidden mechanisms. Reflect on the lives veiled by protocol, and consider how memory and justice might be preserved in your own institutions. Flavia is a composite figure, created to represent survivors of imperial systems described in ancient sources. Some details in this account reflect contested reports. Where possible, we have indicated when ancient writers claim something that modern historians dispute. The purpose of this narrative is to center the human consequences of institutionalized power, and to ask a simple question: how will we guard dignity when structures tempt us to look away? In the end, a red lantern still means something in our story. A small, fragile signal that a life has been called away by forces beyond kinship and consent. To remember those who were summoned and never heard is an act of affirmation. To speak their names, even fictional ones like Flavia, is to refuse the silence that empires privilege.